Your next news update, 8:30. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by On Target Radio. From firearms and Second Amendment rights to personal freedoms and government intrusions. Listen here Sunday nights at 9.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
They got the beat, the campus beat, the campus beat. Yeah, the campus beat.
Yeah, so Senator Bernie Sanders has...
Throwing the long ball, huh?
Well, giving it the old free college try again. Bernie Sanders yesterday rolling out his proposal to make colleges and universities, all higher education, free, meaning taxpayer funded. Also to expunge all higher education related debt, taxpayer funded. Mm-hmm. And it calls to mind, let me paraphrase P.J. O'Rourke. He was referencing healthcare. If you think higher education is expensive now, wait until Bernie Sanders makes it free. Here's Bernie rolling out his plan.
We will make a full and complete education a human right in America to which all of our people are entitled. This means making public colleges, universities, and HBCUs tuition-free and debt-free by tripling the work-study program, expanding Pell Grants, and other financial incentives. Today, we are entering a proposal which will allow every person in this country to get all of the education that they need to live out their dreams because they are Americans. Further, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, it is simply not acceptable that our younger generation, through no fault of their own, will have a lower standard of living than their parents, more debt, lower wages, and less likelihood of owning their own homes. That is why this proposal completely eliminates student debt in this country and ends the absurdity of sentencing an entire generation, the millennial generation, to a lifetime of debt for the crime of doing the right thing, and that is going out and getting a higher education.
Boy, I wonder how much the baby boomers, Bernie Sanders' generation, has to do with breaking that intergenerational compact that has left younger people in the position that he describes. Sanders also explained how he's going to
pay for it?
Pay for this thing that's free for everybody.
Our proposal, which costs $2.2 trillion over 10 years, will be fully paid for by a tax on Wall Street speculation, similar to what exists in dozens of countries around the world. Mm-hmm. The American people bailed out Wall Street. Now it is time for Wall Street to come to the aid of the middle class of this country.
That's a nice little rhetorical device.
So we'd tax Wall Street transactions. That's how it would pay for all this?
That's what he's proposing. Transactions tax of 0.5% on stocks, 0.1% on bonds, and 0.05% on derivatives. He exempts investors of lesser means, offsetting tax credit for people with incomes under 50 and couples with household incomes under 75 grand. Of course,
nice of him.
The Wall Street Journal points out this is very much like the LaSalle Street tax that's been proposed here by the teachers' unions in Chicago. The Wall Street Journal points out it's never going to pay for what he thinks, and he's also way underestimating the costs. This is what government normally does. It also makes if these taxes were to be imposed, makes America's capital markets less liquid, push traders overseas, lowers asset values that would dent every 401k and public pension while raising the cost for institutional investors. So, of course, tax something, you get less of it. You're going to get less investment in trading here. It's also worth noting, you don't like the big banks. Good, neither do I. I didn't want to bail out AIG and by extension Goldman Sachs. Mm-hmm. The political class did. So that was wrong in 2008, 2009. And what Bernie Sanders is proposing is, as I suggested with the P.G. O'Rourke paraphrase, it's also worth pointing out, and this may come to news to Maxine Waters, who's actually the chairman of the House Financial Institutions Committee.
Which scares me to my core.
She doesn't realize that private banks are out of the college loan business. Democrats nationalized student lending in 2010. That's news to Maxine, but okay. In 2010, the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, estimated $87 billion in savings over a decade by putting the government in charge of student lending exclusively. Yeah, they were off by 1.5 trillion. Yeah. More on this. And by the way, just as an aside, I appreciate the point of some who say Wall Street got bailed out with my money. Why am I having to incur this level of debt? I get sort of the unfairness they're speaking to, but the Wall Street bailout was improper, and the college tuitions are improper, and you have to go to base government policy, I think, to start to get to solutions that unwind the unfairness of the government intervening to bail out private risk takers on Wall Street, or, frankly, private risk takers who decide they want to go to Pomona College and major in medieval art.
Well, I met somebody from the Art Institute. She's a masseuse now. She's $127,000 in debt. And, I was talking to her. She said, well, during the Bush administration, the student loan, oh my gosh, what was 11%. And then when Obama came in, it dropped down to 3%. She said, but still, it doesn't matter. I will be working my whole life just to pay this off. And I give her credit. She's paid down $32,000 of it so far, but she has extra jobs to just pay down her student loans. And she's not even doing anything with her degree.
For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by David Feldman. He is professor of economics at the College of William and Mary. He's also the co-author of Why Does College Cost So Much and the Road Ahead for America's Colleges and Universities. And he's written a paper that's worth checking out. I'll tweet it out. Drivers of the Rising Price of College Education. Professor Feldman, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning, Dan and Amy.
So how did you react to what Elizabeth Warren has proposed and then sort of Bernie Sanders doing her one better yesterday?
Well, after your lead-in, I don't know what I'm supposed to say.
Well, you can argue with me. It's okay. You can support what Bernie's saying.
Well, I think there are some good points that Sanders and Warren are making, but I think it is overall a complete muddled jumble of an idea that's putting together things that make no sense economically or in terms of fairness, with other ideas that actually are the way to go. So, for instance, the idea of removing student debt with one stroke of the pen. Mm-hmm. What is the purpose of this other than politics? I mean, there are millions of student debt holders and they vote. So I get the politics of this.
Yeah, they're buying votes.
But this, as Matt Bruenig has written, this is a complete jumble of an idea that is over-inclusive, meaning people who've borrowed $130,000 to get a Harvard MBA and are on track to a very comfortable lifestyle get huge benefit, but it's also under-inclusive. Imagine you've got two people. One has $100,000 in assets and uses those assets to get an education. Another person has $100,000 in assets, but leaves those assets in the stock market and instead borrows to get an education. Who does this idea benefit?
Right. Yeah.
It benefits the person who borrowed, and it punishes, therefore, the person who was prudent and did not.
Yeah, investing, saving, and
investing.
Right.
The idea, and plus, let me ask you a question. Who owns the majority? Who owes the majority of student debt? What income group?
Higher incomes.
Correct. Over 1/3 of student debt is taken on by students in the top quarter of the income distribution. This idea is very regressive. But that may be part of its political charm, because the people who have borrowed a lot tend to be very active voters.
Well, Elizabeth,
No, I'm not at all happy with the idea of waiving away debt. What do we do about people who borrow in 6 years? Are they chopped liver?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, Elizabeth.
What about people?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, sir.
What about people who borrowed in the past and paid it all off? There are fairness issues all surrounding this idea. Likewise, free college, that has some slight advantages. Free college is universal, and it's simple to understand. You can write it on a bumper sticker. But it's not really free college. It's only free tuition, and that's, for many students, that's not the most important cost of attendance. And it only applies at public universities. It doesn't apply to private universities. And it federalizes higher education, which I'm sure you would think is not necessarily the wisest idea.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's actually a great point you make about separating out free tuition from lodging and books and the like.
Correct. And many of the free college programs, although I think not the ones proposed by Sanders and Warren, many of them are what are called second dollar, meaning they only kick in after you've exhausted other sources of money like Pell Grants. So they actually punish the poor because they're entitlements that only go to upper income families who don't qualify for other need-based aid. That's the way the state free college, many of the state free college programs work.
Well, this whole discussion surrounds the cost of college, right? It's getting prohibitive. It's getting.
How do we get there?
Outside of the ability of middle-income families to underwrite it, and then some of these, as you say, top quintile families or individuals from those families are taking on a lot of debt and feeling like I'm not getting a good return on investment. So what is the way out of that trap, I think, is what a lot of middle-income families want to know.
Yeah, well, I think it's less of a trap than many readers think.
Okay.
First of all, I want to distinguish price and cost. Most people, when they think of skyrocketing college cost, what comes to mind are numbers like, Sarah Lawrence and $68,000 tuition bills.
Yeah.
Do you know what fraction of people actually pay the list price tuition at a private college?
How much?
Infinitesimal.
It's like 5%. Only about half the people actually pay the list price at public universities. List price, throw it away. It really doesn't affect most people who are going to college. If you want to ask what has happened to the net price, what the average student is charged, it's not really rising much at private colleges. It's rising mostly at public universities, and the driving engine of that is substantial cutbacks in the state appropriations per full-time student. So this is not the same across all the states. Some states behave much better than others.
Yes.
Some states behave very poorly. By the way, can you name the states that appropriate the least per student, and therefore the states that would get the most benefit if the federal government were to kick in the difference?
And I can name a state that performs poorly because I'm standing in it, but no, I can't. I can't
think of one.
Go,
no.
yeah.
What is it?
Illinois actually behaves much better than the one I'm thinking about.
All right, which one?
Vermont.
Oh, really?
Bernie's home.
Well, I mean, we know how Jane Sanders runs a college into the ground, literally. But that's an aside.
The point is that when you make college free, what you're actually doing is you're having the federal government kick in monies to the state in order to zero out the tuition. Therefore, the monies per student would be the largest in the states that have traditionally behaved the worst toward their higher education systems. And the program would effectively punish the states that have behaved very well and have not cut back their appropriations as much over the past 35 years. So there are all sorts of problems brewing in here, and thinking about how we make college free. If you make college free, you're going to involve the federal government in deciding what colleges can and cannot spend money on.
Now, but let's talk about Illinois, since you seem to be aware of it. Certainly, you have sort of kind of a national perspective, but you're knowledgeable about individual states like Illinois. So, Illinois, University of Illinois, second highest in-state tuition in the Big Ten, and yet the state of Illinois provides twice the national average in per pupil spending to U of I.
Mm-hmm.
So, so you
Well,
can.
let me ask you a question.
You can understand
because I don't have the answer.
Okay.
How much does U of I discount tuition? Meaning, once again, you've got that list price, but what's the average student at U of I pay?
I don't know what
I've
the
got a
average
niece
student
that
pays
goes there, and she got
offhand.
she got a discount. She's paying $30,000 a year.
Out of state.
Out of state. No, she's in state, but she got some academics. She got some discounts through the state because of certain situations.
I teach at a school with a very high list price.
Yeah, William and Mary, sure.
Right.
A very high list price, and most people don't even realize we're a state school. But if you're a family that makes $40,000 a year or less, William and Mary's free.
Wow.
So we discount. So we have a high list price that only applies to students who come from families of means. But we behave sort of like a private university in discounting our tuition based on need. So once again, I caution everybody not to look at the list price and presume that that's what they would have to pay.
I understand, but middle income families. So let's talk about middle income families a little bit above the median household income, right? So so you're talking about 75 to median household income in Illinois is about 55 grand. Let's talk about 55 grand to 120 grand, and you're sending your kid to U of I, which you've been in part underwriting for all those years, and you save for college, and you've got $16,000 as list price tuition plus lodging. You got one a six pack and the books and all that stuff. So maybe you're 25 grand, 30 grand a year all in, and you're not getting much of a discount. You're sort of falling in between where you get a lot of grant money. But you're eligible to finance the education, through debt, and they're saying, well, wait a second, you're talking about free here, and Illinois has got this multi-billion-dollar endowment, and they're not handing out a lot of grant money, scholarship money, and I'm paying the second highest tuition in the Big Ten in state, while we're also providing as taxpayers more than twice the national average in terms of per pupil support. How is that fair to me, who's played by the rules and done everything right?
And I'm not going to comment on U of I's actual tuitions and policies because I don't have the answer.
But just sort of that profile. Forget U of I. Just sort of that profile in America.
All right. This is the group for whom the free college program sounds like a wonderful idea. But there are lots of alternatives to the very complex and often unfair notions that are going about. One of the things that we can do, one of the things that states do, for instance, New York State has long had a program of need-based aid that was more generous than the Pell Grant, meaning it reached up further into the income distribution, right into the families making $60,000, $70,000 a year. I mean, not huge amounts, but enough to help families that are right around the middle of the national income distribution. If you look at the amount of debt that the average student at public universities is taking on, once again, I'm not going to comment on Illinois, although the numbers are discoverable. Students who go to four-year public institutions tend to borrow something around $26,000 to get their degree. This is not the end of the world.
Right.
Are there students who borrow, as Amy, I think you referred to the young lady who went to Pomona and borrowed $120,000 to get a medieval art degree? People make mistakes, but that's an anecdote. In general, the average amount of debt that students take on to acquire a bachelor's degree is one of the best investments that a student can make. It was a wonderful paper a few years ago by Sarah Turner at the University of Virginia with the provocative title, "Do Students Borrow Too Much or Not Enough?" As far as return on investment goes, as long as you are financially aware and a little bit literate, and you are not that Pomona student, debt is a vehicle for achieving significant income gains in the future. By the way, let me ask you a question. I'm doing that a lot. If you look
I
at
already
students who borrow,
graduated. I'm done answering questions. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're not. If you look at students who borrow $10,000, $20,000, or $30,000, which of those groups is more likely to default?
The 10,000.
Correct. Why?
You have to explain your work, Amy. Can't just guess
I
the
thought
right
this
answer.
was just
Correct,
yes or no. You tell me why.
Because
Not
the
borrowing
student
enough.
Well, the student who borrows $10,000 is often a student who drops out after 1 year and winds up with $10,000 in debt and nothing to show for it. The student who borrows $30,000 has probably gone, and is probably coming from a wealthier family, has gone to a university that has more resources to expend on that student. That student graduates and finds that $30,000 debt fairly easy to manage.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a tremendous amount of facts about debt and price out there that just get swept away in the rush to talk about the sky is falling in terms of price and debt.
Okay, we could talk to you about this for 4 hours, so we're going to have you
Yes, you
back.
could.
But one more question. What do you think about income share agreements that are being employed in places like Purdue?
I haven't looked at them enough. The devil is in the details, and one of the things that you don't want to do is encourage adverse selection. You don't want to encourage people to make choices based on knowing the easiest path to get out of things. So I would worry about income share agreements that encourage only the people who are the most likely to default to do these sorts of things. Especially if they're not simply done through the private sector. If they're done through the private sector, I don't care about people who sign these things and then have somebody default on them. I just don't want government agencies on the hook.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a good point. David Feldman, he's a professor of economics, as you could tell, College of William and Mary, co-author of Why College Costs So Much, Why Does College Cost So Much? The Road Ahead for America's Colleges, Universities.